So this is the first in a series of workshops that we'll be hosting through the Center of UN and Global Governance Studies. With us today is Abagail Lawson, who's a 2013 master's degree alumna of the School of Diplomacy. And Abby just completed her 1-year anniversary with the NGO working group on the Security Council. So she's going to tell us all about her experiences in working with the NGO working group. And obviously after that, she's happy to take questions from the audience. So Abby, welcome and welcome back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Thanks. And thank you all for coming. I'm sure the cookies had nothing to do with it. Yeah, so I'm happy to be here to talk about my work as coordinator of the NGO working group on the Security Council, which, as Dr. Edwards said, something I've been doing for the last year. Not quite a year, I think it's in 2 days that I'll have been there for a year. But so what is the NGO working group on the Security Council? Let's start there. I think it's pretty self-explanatory by its name, NGO working group on the Security Council. But just to put it in context a little bit, many of you probably know that NGO participation with the UN, it's okay, grab some cookies. NGO participation with the UN is enshrined in the UN Charter through the Economic and Social Council. NGOs can have consultative status with NGOWSC, and that is probably the main mechanism by which they participate at the UN and attend meetings, etc. But it is not the only way, obviously. And now, as the UN has become a lot more open to the participation of NGOs, they're involved in all corners of the UN system, including the Security Council, which I think is one place where we don't maybe often think of what the role is for NGOs very readily, since a lot of people think of international peace and security or international security in terms of state power and what are states doing, and military power even in a more narrow view. So that, I think, is what makes the NGO working group on the Security Council interesting or unique in this respect, is that it was formed and has become over the last 17, 18 years almost, a sort of solidification of the relationship between the Council and NGOs. Not in any sort of formal way as far as UN documentation goes, but as far as establishing a practice of the Council members meeting and engaging with civil society. That is sort of what we do, or what we were intended to do from the start. So a little history about the working group. It has its origins in a loose coalition of NGOs that came together around efforts to reform the Security Council that were happening in the GA in the mid-1990s. So if you study the UN, you probably also know that Security Council reform is sort of a perpetual topic. Sometimes there's political will, or it seems like there's political will and momentum built up around it, and the GA, or segments of the GA get mobilized. And so this is one of those points, and a group of NGOs led by an organization called Global Policy Forum decided that they wanted to engage on this topic of Security Council reform. And so they held a public conference in 1994, and over the next 2 years they held a series of public meetings with the President of the General Assembly and other key ambassadors. And these went really well. They were really successful. A lot of NGOs were there. They were building relationships with the ambassadors and on the council and not on the council. But as so often tragically happens, the efforts to reform the council lost steam in 1996, and so this group of NGOs was sort of faced with a choice. Did they want to continue to push for council reform and try to work on this issue when it seemed like politically it wasn't really going to go anywhere in the near future, or did they want to try to do something else? And the leaders at Global Policy Forum felt like they had an opportune moment with some friendly, NGO-friendly ambassadors, and decided to reach out to ambassadors on the council individually and try to engage them in dialogue on the work of the council itself, not necessarily limited to reform, and just talking about all the issues that are on the council's agenda. Now, this happened in 1996. This is a time when the UN system was not as open as it is today, I'll say, to NGOs and the public, and definitely the Security Council was not very open to NGOs. The Security Council has a reputation for being fairly opaque within the UN and let alone to NGOs and the public. Obviously, this has changed a lot over the last 20 years, I would say, but at this time, when a bunch of NGOs are writing to ambassadors and saying, we want to talk to you about what's going on in the council, it was met with a kind of like, no thanks. But regardless of that, with the help of some very key ambassadors, because sometimes member states need to be convinced by other member states that talking to civil society is a good idea. The ambassador of Italy and Portugal in particular at the time were very instrumental in this. And this group of NGOs eventually got meetings with all the council members, including all the P5. Russia was first to meet with the NGO working group out of the P5, fun fact. And they began building relationships with the missions and building a reputation as a high-level group, a well-informed group that held really useful meetings. That is what allows us to continue to have these meetings for going on, like I said, 17 years now. So throughout the late 90s, they were meeting regularly with the council, and everything was going well. So in 1998, the group solidified itself and became what we now call the NGO Working Group on the Security Council. They elected a steering committee, all the fun stuff about establishing bylaws and solidifying the secretariat arrangement to handle the day-to-day administration and the liaising with missions. And at first, the first secretariat was held by Global Policy Forum, the group I mentioned at the start, and is now held by an organization called the World Federalist Movement / Institute for Global Policy, which is the same organization that holds the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, if you're familiar with that group of NGOs. And they have a real role for playing a convening part in mobilizing NGOs around issues, so that's sort of why they took over from GPF. Last year, actually. And so that's where I work as the coordinator in the secretariat of the NGO working group. I'm the primary administrator, and I'm the one who calls the missions and sends the emails and works out when we're going to meet with the ambassadors and everything. But as to how the NGO working group itself operates, membership in the group is on an individual basis, which is sort of a little, I guess, unique about for an NGO working group. A lot of other working groups, it's the organization that's a member, and anyone can represent that organization at meetings. But since the point of the NGO working group was to be a high-level informed dialogue, we ask individual members to apply, or individuals to apply, submit their CV to make sure that, with nothing against interns, that we're not having a meeting with an ambassador in a room full of interns necessarily every week, and to make sure that we're having an informed, high-level discussion. So from that, you can tell membership is closed. It's by application only, so organizations have to apply to be members, and that is not to be exclusionary for the point of being exclusionary, but just to keep the numbers manageable. Currently, we have 36 members. Our official bylaws say something like we have around 30 members, and that's the strictest it gets. And we also try to maintain a diversity of members. So international peace and security is can be a pretty broad area. So we have members in all aspects of that, from human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, to humanitarian organizations, Oxfam and Doctors Without Borders, religious organizations that do humanitarian relief. We have organizations that do peace and conflict resolution and mediation, and women, peace and security, international justice. We have more policy analysis organizations like International Crisis Group, Security Council Report. So basically trying to cover all aspects of what goes on in the council, or what could be considered by the council. So that's what it is, what the working group is, but what do we actually do? As you may have guessed from what I've been saying, we have meetings. We have a lot of meetings with the ambassadors on the council. In the spirit of how the group came about, our primary function is to provide a platform for access for NGOs to the council, to create a forum for dialogue between NGO leaders and the ambassadors on the council, and to build relationships between those two groups. So the group in its current form is not an advocacy organization. We don't undertake advocacy positions as an NGO working group on anything, even Security Council reform, nothing like that. Obviously, our members do their own advocacy on whatever their mandate is concerned with, so the humanitarian organizations work on those issues and everything else, but we as a group don't undertake positions as a whole. In practical terms, what we do is have 3 to 4 meetings a month with countries on the council at the level of the permanent representative, which is the highest level in the mission. And this is the established practice. I will say we always meet with the PR, with the singular exception in the last few years where we've met with the DPR of one mission. All of our meetings are off the record, so this is to encourage ambassadors to be forthcoming about what's going on, and also for NGOs to honestly express themselves as well. And usually start with a briefing by the ambassador and then interactive Q&A, which is the dialogue part, which is so important to our mission. And we also meet, in addition to the council ambassadors, we meet with high-level UN officials working in areas of peace and security. So Department of Peacekeeping Operations, political affairs, humanitarian affairs, special representatives of the Secretary General, those kinds of people. And the meetings themselves, like I've been saying, are an opportunity to exchange information on what's being considered by the council. So the ambassadors share, depending on how forthcoming they feel like being, they share behind-the-scenes information on the status of negotiations or dynamics in the council around certain issues or what's coming up in the council, what they're considering in the future. And NGOs bring perspectives from the field that missions might not have. And they also are able to raise issues that are important to their own work and their advocacy around the UN headquarters. One thing I would like to say here, because I talk about the NGO working group a lot, and people ask me, a common response I guess that I get is, okay, we see how this is useful for NGOs who get to go to these meetings and hear things that they might not know otherwise. The ambassador can tell them behind the scenes information, it's useful for their advocacy, but what is the value added for member states? Like, what do they get out of this? And in my view, there's a lot of value for member states in engaging with civil society. 3 main things that I'll say here. The first is that we don't always think of this, but NGOs do have information that missions don't, especially for the elected 10 members of the council in the smaller countries who maybe don't have embassies everywhere around the world. They don't have official representation in the Central African Republic, or they don't have people in South Sudan. One of their primary sources of information are NGOs. They read the International Crisis Group report on the situation, or they read the Human Rights Watch report on the situation, or they talk to the representative from Doctors Without Borders about what's going on in Syria or whatever. So you can definitely see, especially with the elected 10 members of the council, that they do come to the meetings to gather information and to get more information on what they may have already read from our members. The second thing is that some NGOs are doing work in conflict situations before the council is doing work on these situations. So an example, or before the council is addressing certain aspects of situations, I'll say. This example I'll give is Syria. When the council passed its resolution on Resolution 2139 on humanitarian aid, and before they negotiated another resolution on authorizing cross-border delivery of aid. At this point in time, it was sort of stalled because the UN was having a lot of issues accessing certain areas of the country. They couldn't get in, the government wasn't giving them permission. But some of our members continued to operate and deliver humanitarian aid throughout that entire time period, and they had been for years before that. So they were able to discuss with the missions, you know, this is what we're seeing on the ground, this is how we're getting access to these areas, these are the dynamics we're encountering. And it's just another a sort of built-up expertise that NGOs do have that can be useful when the UN or member states are sort of stalled because of political or whatever reasons they might encounter. And then a third sort of value-added piece, I guess, is that NGOs can raise or bring alternative and innovative approaches to issues that the council is discussing. And similar to that, they also amplify the voices of civil society on the ground. So governments are represented throughout the UN. The Secretariat's very clued into member states. They have to be because they're sort of dictated by the member state politics to an extent. But the voice of civil society is really important. And NGOs often do things differently than governments can or would do, and same with the UN, who's sometimes bound by its own standard operating procedures in certain situations. So a quick example of this today, actually, is the deployment of the UN peacekeeping operation in Central African Republic. They're taking over from the African Union troops there. Leading up to this, we had a bunch of meetings with DPKO and the ambassadors over the last year since they established the peacekeeping mission. We kept hearing about these challenges of communication throughout the country. There's no infrastructure, there are no radio towers, they can't get engineers out to build radio towers before they can have roads, and it's raining, and there's just no way to do this, and this was a huge challenge that we kept hearing. And some of our members in meetings raised, we are doing the way that we deal with this challenge, because they're also operating in the Central African Republic, and they're also doing the same work that the peacekeeping mission will be doing, or similar at least as far as protection of civilians and humanitarian work. And they brought forth this idea of community-based networks of communication. We have members who have established community networks throughout the country, and that's how they pass information along. That's how they make sure that people know about the peacekeeping mission. This is crucial when this mission is deploying, that people know what it's there to do. That's how they make sure that people know about a peace agreement that was, signed by the leaders at the highest level in some other capital of some other country, and the people out in rural CAR may not know what the provisions of the agreement were. So our members, or NGOs in general, I guess, bring these sort of alternative approaches of without sounding too grassroots, but it's true, and they come up with, I guess, can be a little more creative in their responses and the way that they approach things. And I can talk about this for a while, because as I've attended more and more meetings of the council and more of these meetings talking to the ambassadors, I've become much more convinced of the real need to include civil society at the table of people maintaining international peace and security, because this is a huge part of the population that's being affected by all these things, and also people who are working on these exact same issues that the council is also dealing with. So that's really, I guess, why the meetings are useful, in my opinion. In addition to the meetings, the NGO working group also serves as a network for NGOs to connect with each other, to build advocacy coalitions. Like I said, we don't do advocacy on the whole, but our members do, and they build coalitions amongst themselves, and I would like to think that our meetings play an important role in that. And also for the missions, to have a network of NGOs working on peace and security that they know, people that they know. And I have gotten phone calls from missions wanting to circulate invitations to their events because they want to make sure that our members are there. Gotten phone calls from missions when they have an official visiting from their capital, and do we want to have a reception and an opportunity to talk to them. We met, DPKO actually reached out to us multiple times in the lead up to this deployment today to update on the status of the UN sort of handover in the peacekeeping mission there, and to discuss challenges. And granted, I'm not trying to make it sound like the NGO working group is the end-all be-all for NGOs in New York or even around the UN. And sometimes I think missions will meet with us to be able to check a little box and say, we engage with civil society, yay, look at us, we support NGOs. And that does happen. But I think overall, it is a really useful relationship for both the NGOs and the missions. Let's see. So we've been doing this for 17 years now, like I said, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the UN system used to be pretty closed to NGOs, but now I can't really say that. It's opened up a lot, and especially the Security Council. I mean, just they have a website, and what's available on their website is huge compared to 20 years ago. And a lot of NGOs now have their own relationships, bilateral relationships with missions that have nothing to do with the NGO working group. And they do a lot of their advocacy bilaterally instead of at this platform. So right now I think we have a sort of challenge to figure out the best way and to make sure that we're still adding value in some way. Like how useful are the meetings? Are they as useful as they could be for both the NGOs and the countries? So we do that through trying to be creative, trying to reach out to new people. Obviously, the 15 members of the council, we can't do anything more than that. But then, as well as we reach out to new UN officials. Like this year, we met with the head of the Peace and Security section at UN Women. We met with a special advisor to the Secretary General on the responsibility to protect, which is a controversial thing. We met with Secretariat officials on the Human Rights Due Diligence Policy, which is a policy of screening peacekeepers for human rights violations before they're allowed to deploy in peacekeeping missions. So we have some more technical meetings like that. We meet with the Department of Field Support, which handles all of sort of the technical side of peacekeeping missions. And we're exploring the possibility of holding thematic meetings on specific country issues to really engage, I guess, in a more in-depth discussion than what happens in the council. Because on some issues, for example, Israel-Palestine, the politics of that issue are so entrenched that at least in New York, you can't even have a conversation about it. I mean, everybody knows what everyone's going to say, and no one ever says anything differently. So we're trying to see how we might be able to utilize our role as sort of a neutral group, since we don't take positions as a whole, to provide a forum for real discussion on some of these politically controversial topics. As far as immediately, in this December, we will have a meeting with the newly elected members of the council. So every year, 5 new members are elected to the council on a rotating basis. And every year in December, we hold a meeting with all 5 of them together in one room, and it's usually hosted by one outgoing member of the council who has been particularly supportive of NGOs, so that they can, reassure the newly elected members, like, this is a legit group, this is worth engaging with, because like I said, sometimes member states need to hear it from another member state in order to be convinced. So we'll do that in December. We've met with 4 out of the 5 P5 members this year. I'm still holding out hope that we'll get the 5th before the end of the year, but we'll see. And yeah, that in a nutshell is the NGO working group. And I can stop here for questions before, yeah.
I really want to know who that 5th one.
Oh, the person we haven't met with this year? The Chinese. We haven't met with China, yeah. We have in the past, about once a year, but not this year. It's been very busy. Are there any more questions right now on anything? NGOs, the Security Council? Yeah.
Well, I want to know, you mentioned that you guys have up to 36 members.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of regional presentation or local civil society, do you guys have any members that are, I know could be international, but in terms of regional presentation?
Yeah, so all of the organizations, I would say, are international. The sort of deciding factor to be a member is that you have to have a permanent presence in New York. So you can be, because it's all around the Security Council, so you have to be able to engage with the council. So all of our members are international, and we have some that are headquartered elsewhere outside New York, but do have like a representative in New York full-time around the UN to do all their advocacy and things like that. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all.
So since the founding of the NGO working group,
Mm-hmm.
like now, what could be what would you say has been the major achievement of the organization? Since I know NGOs sometimes are allowed to be in the meeting, but they are not as influential when it comes to the decision making. So what has been the major achievement so far, and what do you deal with the frustration dealing with the council?
Okay, well, major achievement, I will say. one thing right off the bat is that NGOs that we have a relationship with the council at all. Because like I said, at the start, it was a major hurdle to even get the permanent representative to meet with a group of NGOs and to treat it not like a press conference where you're just repeating your country's position, but to actually engage in discussion on this is what the council is doing. These are the honest political dynamics of what's going on, and this is what we're trying to do. So that's one, I would say, major achievement. Another, I mean, you are correct in saying, like, in the meetings of the council, maybe NGOs don't have that much influence in a council meeting, but a lot of things that happen at the UN, most of the sort of lobbying and advocacy goes on behind the scenes. And so our members do engage very actively with the council members bilaterally outside of our meetings. I mean, even inside, you know, we say that meetings aren't supposed to be opportunities for NGO members to stand up and give like a direct advocacy presentation, but instead to like engage in dialogue. And you know, you see sort of subtle advocacy happening when people raise questions about issues like, oh, have you guys considered XYZ or doing this in South Sudan instead of this? So there is influence happening, and I've seen it in meetings where there are questions going on, and the council member says to the NGO, we need to talk about this. Like, you're talking about how you guys have supported local ceasefires in Syria. Like, you should be talking to my expert at the mission, and we should bring this in to the next resolution. And that does happen. I can't claim, like, the NGO working group can't claim credit for that, but NGOs do have an impact on the work of the council, I would say.
I know you said the working group doesn't take any positions or stances on any specific, but can you think of one, or do you know any issue that if it were to arise, they would feel the need and the obligation to take a stance?
Well, it's hard because we have 36 organizations that would have to come to agreement on something. And you're talking about 36 organizations that the one unifying, there might be others amongst, you know, 15 or 20 organizations, but the one unifying factor among all 36 is that they work with the Security Council. They don't all do it in the same way. I mean, you have like groups working on disarmament who might not have maybe they have opinions, but their organization doesn't have a position on humanitarian affairs. So sort of, first of all, the issue that would arise that all the members would say, we should say something, I'm not really sure what that would be, they would feel like their mandate of their organization moves them to take a position with all these other groups. And I just don't think it's our mandate really there are other NGOs that do coalition building on issues as they arise, and they're members of the working group actually whose primary function is to identify crises or conflicts that civil society should be involved in, and they come together and decide on a position and do advocacy that way. It's not really our mandate per se. The only thing I could even think of would be something to do with Security Council working methods or Security Council reform, but that's pretty politically, it's just pretty political, so it would be hard as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Now, a lot of the case that you said in terms of how the NGO working group has worked with the Security Council, things like South Sudan and the CAR, there are usually issues where it's more how to accomplish something rather than what. But how would the NGO working group approach a problem like the biggest one I can think of right now facing Security Council is Ukraine, where you have such entrenched interests on both sides that it's really tough to get them to come together on an issue?
Yeah, Ukraine's not actually on the Security Council's agenda. Say that. Because the agenda itself is politicized, as you might imagine. People don't want it on the council's agenda. Not that anything would happen if it were, because you have people with vetoes, and that sort of complicates things right off the bat. On Ukraine, I mean, in situations like that, civil society is usually the one being like, we know that this is politically impossible, but you still should be talking about it. For example, when the Ukraine, I guess, situation first started to heat up and the council first started its long series of meetings on the topic, there was a resolution actually tabled in the council, which was vetoed, obviously, but some of our members in subsequent meetings with ambassadors asked, there's a provision in the charter that requires a council member who's a party to a dispute to remove themselves from the vote. They're not supposed to be allowed to vote. And why did anyone raise this in regard to the Ukraine resolution? Did anyone talk about this? Obviously, meaning why was Russia allowed to vote on this resolution, arguing that they are a party to the conflict, and obviously you can debate that if you want, and people would have different views about it, but it was something that the NGOs did raise, and they, I would say, try to do that even in situations that seem like politically are completely locked. And some of it is, talking with the council ambassadors, okay, we know that the politics on this are so entrenched, but what do you think? Is there any possibility that the council can do anything? And sometimes the conclusion is no. No, they're not gonna, these two countries or these four countries are not gonna change their position. And so at the moment, there's nothing in the council happening. And you can see, from a civil society perspective, without getting too bleeding heart, you can see these people who are on the ground in the situations either in Ukraine or in Syria when they couldn't get the council to pass a resolution on Syria, who are like, can you guys please pull yourselves together, snap out of it, we have to do something, and we're still here every day trying to do this work, and you are sitting in New York and not, what exactly are you doing? So it is, I would say, sometimes a source of frustration. But yeah, it comes with working in international politics, I think. Yeah, any more questions?
Well, I remember you mentioned something earlier about the Security Council reform,
Mm-hmm.
that it was on the agenda until it gradually disappeared around 1996.
Mm-hmm.
Is it still one of the agendas on the list of the working group right now?
No. Well, it's not. The working group itself doesn't really have an agenda other than what is the Security Council considering. And Security Council reform is definitely still something that a lot of our members, or a fair amount of our members, do work on. So, like I said, the working group itself isn't focused on Security Council reform anymore, but there are a lot of members who are working.
But I mean a common messaging from the NGO community. What is the common messaging from the NGO community to the Security Council or to the General Assembly?
On council reform?
Yes.
Right now, I would say the focus, well, there's two things. One is there's an initiative going on amongst a group of member states called the ACT Initiative, which is Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency is what it stands for, and it's an acronym, of course. And that is a group of member states led by Switzerland who are trying to improve the working methods of the council. So it has nothing to do with expanding the council or getting more permanent members or anything like that, but talking about how do we make the council more accountable to the rest of the UN, how do we make it more transparent, and how do we improve the overall quality of work that the council is doing, because they have a lot on their plate, and sometimes it just seems like they're going into the meetings, reading their statements, and leaving, and that's not supposed to be the point of the Security Council. So that's one way. And the working group, the NGO working group, we have met with the ACT group and members of the ACT Initiative to talk about these issues, to talk about working methods and working methods reform. Because I guess we're both groups who engage a lot with the council, so we have a unique perspective, or an informed perspective anyway. And the second thing I would say that's big right now is the idea of restricting the use of veto in the council. Last year around the GA, I think the French foreign minister wrote an op-ed about the P5 restraining from using their veto and establishing a code of conduct so that when all these conditions are met, the P5 agree that they're not going to use their veto to block council action to address a situation of mass atrocity. And that's still ongoing. We have some members who work with the French who are working on this idea of how do we make sure that the politics of the council don't prevent it from even addressing an issue. And I think this arose out of a lot of examples, but one of the most recent was Syria, and the council voted, it voted on a resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. And it was sort of seen as like, this is something that needs to be done, we need to promote accountability, and it was vetoed. And this sort of galvanized a bunch of NGOs to be like, we need to do something about this. That I think is very difficult, because getting the P5 to not veto or to agree that there's any situation that they would restrict themselves when it's viewed as sort of a right of being a permanent member is difficult. Yeah.
Did you want to try to talk about job advice?
Yes. I can, or are there other?
Well, I just had a quick question about your personal experience, because you talked about how each meeting starts with a briefing by the ambassador. And I was wondering if you ever noticed that ambassadors come and kind of say their piece just so they can get it over with. Because you mentioned that you feel like some people meet it with you just to check off the box. Is there any sort of standard for the ambassadors bring to make sure they actually bring something to the table that's legitimate and helpful for discussion?
It's a good question. It really depends on the ambassador, to be honest with you. And also the relationship they have with some of the people in the room, because some of our members do a lot of advocacy bilaterally, and so some of them know the ambassadors really well, and then the ambassador is much more comfortable talking openly about things. As far as anything to make sure that they bring something, we don't really, yell at the ambassador like, please say something that we don't already know. But after the briefing there's Q&A and people can sort of try to tease things out, but it really depends on the ambassador and how much they want to share. The elected members are generally, I would say, more forthcoming on a consistent basis, and I think, in my personal view, I think that has to do with the fact that they also get a lot of information and are open to getting a lot of information from NGOs, so it is a real exchange. But yeah, some of the P5 are great too. I don't want anyone to think that they're not. But yeah, I can talk a little bit about job advice, I guess, for whatever advice it is that I have. I'm not really going to tell you anything, I don't think, that you probably haven't already heard. Two of the most harped on topics in undergrad and grad school are internships and networking, and that's pretty much what I have to say. The internships that I did while I was in grad school were actually like where I met the most people and where I built the most relationships. I think that ended up helping me after graduation. And in particular, talking to a group of students, I would encourage you to take advantage of your time as a student, because a lot of internships require you to be a student in order to be eligible to do them. And I recognize that it's sort of, people have financial constraints, they have to work, you have classes and everything, but if you have time to do an internship, even part-time, if you can find 10 hours a week or whatever to volunteer with an organization, a lot of places now need people to do things online from home, and even just that experience and the sort of connections you make, even just over email, are really valuable. And in that same sort of vein, something I would also encourage you to do is to be creative about opportunities, to find ways to get experience and get exposure. Even if it's not through an official internship or something, if you are interested in, what you want to do is to go work at a refugee camp in DRC, and you don't have any experience in any way related to that, or you don't feel like you do, and you have never been to the DRC, and how am I going to get field experience? Step one is take a couple hours on a Saturday, go volunteer and do mock job interviews for refugees living in New York or recent immigrants. Right there is a way to get experience working with a population of people, and also to meet other organizations that are doing this sort of work on maybe the other side of what you're aiming to do. So it's just one example, but I'm just saying you be a little bit creative, especially if you have time constraints or jobs and everything else to juggle. And then networking, which is maybe goes hand in hand with internships and things, but is very important. There are so many events going on in New York, even here, around the UN. If you're not interested in the UN, then find out what's going on, because so much happens in New York. It's ridiculous, and so many of the other universities and things hold events that you can go to, and a lot of times NGO events or events happening around the UN are open to the public. You just have to be on the right email list. So if you know people who are interning for organizations, or if you know people at different organizations, ask them to let you know when things are happening, and your professors are great resources for that. And let's see. Yeah, I'm someone personally who hates networking. I've always hated networking. I'm not a very outgoing person, so I find it a little bit difficult to go up to someone and strike up a conversation that makes me look good and sells myself so that I can get a job and makes a good connection. But the best advice I ever got about networking was from a former undergrad professor of mine who was also a bit of an introvert, and said she would force herself to go to these events, and at these events she said she would have to talk to 2 people and then she could go home. And it could be just, hi, introduce myself, and then, person on my left, person on my right, and then I can leave. But you establish a practice of sticking around and introducing yourself to people and talking to people. And it makes it a lot easier if you sort of bribe yourself with the thought of going home. That's for people who networking comes difficult to them, and I am one of those people. And the last thing I'll say is, as a student, again, you're in a very great position to have an excuse to make cold introductions to people working in this field. You're in a class and you're studying a topic, or you're doing a research project, and even if you don't need to do interviews for your research, you should send an email to someone working at whatever organization if you're interested in, I guess just refugees. Again, there are dozens of organizations doing that have people in New York, and people love to talk to students. They love to talk about what they're doing. They love to talk about their own work, and they like to give advice, whether or not they're qualified to give it. So you have a really great excuse, I think, as a student in classes and doing projects, and you can reach out to people and just be like, this is what I'm studying, and I'd love to talk to you about what your organization is doing in this area or this particular topic. It's also a great way to make yourself look good, because you're informed, supposedly, on the topic, and you have something to actually talk about. So that's my 2 cents on jobs. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions on that or comments? Completely disagree with anything that I said? No?
All right, well, if there are no further questions, Abby, again, thank you so very much for coming, and thanks everyone for coming out.